Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The quantum-encoded packet arrived on a Tuesday, which Ethan Rourke had always considered the most suspicious day of the week. Mondays announced themselves. Fridays had the decency to be anticipated. But Tuesdays had a way of arriving with something tucked behind their backs, and this one was no different, except that what this particular Tuesday had tucked behind its back was, apparently, an interstellar job offer delivered through 11 layers of encrypted diplomatic relay and routed, for reasons no one at the Earth Coalition Joint Advisory Bureau ever satisfactorily explained, through the personal inbox of his secretary, a woman named Diane who had been trying to retire for 3 years and took this latest development as a personal affront. "It says it's from an empire," she told him, standing in the doorway of his office with the expression of someone who has found something unpleasant on the bottom of their shoe and is deciding whether to mention it. "Which one?" "The Selûne." She said the word carefully, as if mispronouncing it might make it more real. "For star systems, hereditary monarchy, 6,000 years old apparently." Rourke looked up from the tactical report. He had been annotating with the focused attention of a man who had been annotating tactical reports for 20 years and had recently begun to wonder if this was all there was. "What do they want?" Diane looked at the packet, then at him, then at the packet again. "A consultant," she said, "military, strategic, preferably human." She paused. "You specifically by name." "How do they know my name?" "The packet doesn't say. It does say, and I'm reading this directly, no outstanding warrants in any jurisdiction recognized by the Selûne Empire." She lowered the packet. "I've checked. You qualify." "That's a low bar." "I've always thought so." He read the full packet that evening. In the apartment that had accumulated over the years, the particular atmosphere of a place where someone sleeps and works, but does not especially live. The Selûne Empire was engaged in a border conflict with something called the Haruvek Collective. Their command structure was ancient, consensus-driven, and producing strategic recommendations of what the packet diplomatically described as insufficient operational utility, which Rourke translated, from bureaucratic into plain language, as meaning their generals were giving the Queen beautiful, useless advice, and everyone involved was too polite to say so. They wanted an outside perspective. They wanted human experience. They wanted, specifically, someone whose species had spent enough centuries making difficult choices in difficult wars to understand what those choices actually cost. They were, in other words, hiring him because humanity had a long and well-documented history of making terrible decisions under pressure, and they wanted someone who understood the taxonomy of terrible decisions from the inside. He took the contract. Diane did not say she told him so, but she updated his out-of-office message with an efficiency that suggested she had been composing it mentally for some time. The Selûne Imperial Station Velanath was, by any reasonable measure, enormous. It orbited a gas giant the color of old bruises at the edge of the Selûne home system, and it was the kind of structure that communicated, through sheer architectural confidence, that its designers had never once considered the possibility of building anything small. The corridors were wide enough to drive a transport through. The ceilings suggested a species that had looked at the concept of altitude and decided to be ambitious about it. The chair in the receiving chamber, when he finally reached it after 40 minutes of escort through hallways that seemed to grow more formal with every intersection, was a magnificent object, curved, luminous, made of some material that caught the station's ambient light and held it. And it was completely, structurally incompatible with a human spine. He sat at an angle that his lower back would discuss with him for the next 3 days and waited. The Selûne officers arranged around the chamber watched him with the particular expression of people who are too disciplined to stare and are staring anyway. He counted 11 of them. He smiled at the nearest one, a tall officer whose rank insignia suggested seniority, and whose posture suggested he had not smiled voluntarily since early in the previous administration. The officer did not smile back. Rourke made a mental note to find out what passed for humor in this civilization, and then made a second mental note that the first note was probably optimistic. Then the doors opened, and Queen Valith entered, and the room changed in the way that rooms only change when the person who owns them finally arrives. She was close to 2 meters tall, and her skin was a deep, smooth ash gray, faintly translucent at the wrists and temples where bioluminescent veins traced cold blue light beneath the surface, brighter when she focused, dimmer in the pauses between thoughts, a physiological tell she had apparently decided she was too composed to bother concealing. She had 4 fingers on each hand, with an extra joint that gave her gestures an unhurried, continuous quality, as though every movement were a sentence completing itself. Her eyes were large and copper irised, set slightly wider than a human face would arrange them, and her hair moved very faintly, without wind or current, with the kind of autonomous drift that Rourke's brain registered, flagged as unusual, and then quietly declined to fully explain. She looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they have read a great deal about and are now calibrating against reality. He looked back at her the way someone looks at a thing they were told what to expect and did not entirely believe. "Mr. Rourke," she said, in standard that sounded like translated poetry, "I am told you are the most honest military mind your planet's advisory system was willing to part with." "They had others," he said, "but they were using them." The bioluminescent veins at her temples brightened, very briefly, and she sat down across from him and opened the briefing, and the next 4 hours were the most interesting Tuesday he had ever had. 7 weeks into his posting, Rourke made the mistake of asking the station's supply system for coffee. The system, which was sophisticated enough to model 17 distinct categories of Selûne atmospheric preference, and could synthesize nutrient compounds at a molecular level, returned a 40-second pause that he could only interpret as the computational equivalent of confusion, followed by something that was brown, warm, and smelled approximately like coffee, the way a photograph of a fire approximately provides heat. He drank it anyway. His aide, Solith, watched this with the expression of someone witnessing a minor cultural tragedy. "There is nutrient concentrate," Solith said. 17 varieties. The 4th is considered very calming. "I don't want to be calm," Rourke said. "I want to be functional." Solith, who was young and precise, and approached every problem with the focused sincerity of someone who had not yet learned to be cynical about outcomes, wrote something in his notation pad. Rourke suspected he was documenting the coffee incident for the official consultation record. He also suspected that somewhere in the Selûne Imperial Archives, future historians would one day find an entry titled something like, "Human advisor refuses optimal nutrition in favor of ritualistic brown liquid, day 49. The work, at least, was real. The Haruvek border situation had been deteriorating for years before Rourke arrived, in the way that border situations deteriorate when 2 civilizations have adjacent ambitions and insufficient diplomatic imagination, slowly, then less slowly, and then all at once in ways that surprise everyone except the people who had been pointing at the charts. Rourke spent his first weeks reading everything the Selûne Strategic Archive had on the conflict, which was comprehensive, beautifully organized, and almost entirely useless from a practical standpoint, because it had been produced by a command structure that filtered every difficult option through so many layers of institutional consensus that the options arrived on Valith's desk soft as bread. There was no dishonesty in it. Everyone involved believed what they were recommending. It was simply that centuries of unbroken civilization had produced generals who were deeply, organically unsuited to recommending anything their queen might find distressing. Valith found this distressing in a different and more fundamental way. She made this clear on a morning in his 8th week, during a strategic review that had been running for 2 hours and produced, so far, 3 tactical recommendations that Rourke had been sitting with in increasing silence. She looked at him across the briefing table with the particular attention she used when she already suspected something and was waiting for confirmation. "You have a face," she said. "I generally do," he said. "You have a specific face. You have had it for 40 minutes. He looked at the 3 recommendations laid out on the projection surface between them. Then he said, with the care of a man selecting his words the way a combat engineer selects his footing, that the 3 options her senior command had submitted were, in his professional assessment, the same option wearing 3 different sets of clothes, none of which fit particularly well. The room, which contained 6 of those senior commanders, became very quiet. The bioluminescent veins at Valeth's temples brightened to something close to cold fire. "Show me," she said. The next 2 hours were different. He walked through it. The overlapping assumptions built into all 3 proposals, the places where the strategic logic doubled back on itself, because the commanders had unconsciously constrained their thinking to options they knew their queen could approve without discomfort, the gaps where genuine alternatives existed if you were willing to name them plainly. Valeth asked questions that were pointed and fast, and he answered them the same way, and by the end of it, the projection surface looked like something had been thoroughly argued with, which it had. Afterward, when the commanders had filed out with the careful dignity of people processing information they were not certain how to feel about, Solith appeared at Rourke's shoulder and informed him, in a tone of hushed professional reverence, that he was the first outside consultant in recorded Selûne history to tell the Queen that her senior command had submitted the same bad idea 3 times. "How many outside consultants have there been?" Rourke asked. Solith checked his pad. 4. "What happened to the others?" A pause. "They found the chairs very comfortable." It was during the 11th week that Rourke drew his line. It came up the way these things come up, not as a decision, but as an item, something buried in a theoretical options matrix that some careful, thorough analyst had included to demonstrate completeness of consideration. Targeted strikes on Haruvek's civilian infrastructure, listed between 2 logistical proposals with the same neutral formatting, as though it were simply another tool in the strategic inventory. He removed it from the matrix himself. He explained why to Valeth directly in the private briefing that followed the main session. He told her about Earth, not as history, not as abstraction, but as something he had studied with the specific attention of someone trying to understand how civilizations lose themselves. He had read the tribunal records, the declassified strategic documents, the later accounts written by the people who had authorized the choices, and then spent the remainder of their lives constructing frameworks for why the choices had been necessary. The frameworks were always very elaborate. The necessity was always very convincing. The cost was always the same. He told her there was exactly one category of recommendation he would never provide. He documented the conversation, as he documented everything, a habit she viewed as excessive, and he had never once reconsidered. He told her that if that line ever became the only available option, he would tell her so plainly, and he would tell her equally plainly that she was on her own. Valeth listened to all of this without interruption. The light beneath her skin settled into something even and quiet. Then she told him she understood his position and respected it, and that she had not brought him across 11 layers of interstellar relay to ignore the things he told her. He believed her. It was, he would later reflect, entirely consistent with everything he knew about her, and absolutely the wrong conclusion to draw. The Vel'Tharath corridor fell on a Wednesday, which Rourke found grimly appropriate. He had been warning about the corridor for 11 weeks. He had submitted 4 written assessments, 2 revised tactical projections, and 1 document that he had titled, with diminishing patience, Final Assessment Regarding Vel'Tharath Corridor Vulnerability, and why I continue to mention it. The Selûne Command had read all of these with great care, and defended the corridor with insufficient force anyway, partly for logistical reasons, partly for political ones, and partly because of a deep institutional conviction that the Haruvek Collective would not actually do the thing they had been visibly, methodically preparing to do for the better part of 3 months. The Haruvek did the thing. Rourke was in the middle of his morning briefing when the alert came through, a cascading sequence of tactical notifications that Solith received on his pad and read, with the expression of someone opening a letter they already know contains bad news. He looked up at Rourke. Rourke looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment that had the particular quality of a moment in which everything that comes next will be worse than everything that came before. "The corridor," Solith said. "I know," Rourke said. "You did say." "I know, Solith. 4 times in writing. I am aware of how many times I said it." Solith looked at his pad again. 5 times, actually. I filed the last one." Rourke drank what the station's supply system was currently calling coffee and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because he had learned, over a career built on the management of avoidable disasters, that the moment immediately after an avoidable disaster was not the time for "told you so," regardless of how thoroughly you had told them so. The emergency session convened at 3 in the morning station time, in the primary strategic chamber, which was the largest room on Velanath and felt, at that hour, both too large and not large enough. Every senior commander was present. Every projection surface was active, running real-time tactical feeds from the corridor that confirmed, from multiple angles and in several resolutions, that the situation was exactly as bad as the initial reports had indicated and slightly worse than that. Rourke stood at his usual position to the left of the main display and watched the assembled commanders process the data with the collective composure of people who had been trained, over centuries of institutional culture, to never visibly panic, and who were currently applying that training at full capacity. Valith arrived 7 minutes after the session opened. She looked at the displays. She looked at the numbers. She looked at Rourke briefly, with an expression he couldn't fully decode, which was unusual because by this point he could read her with reasonable accuracy. Then she began asking questions, and the questions were surgical in the way that her questions were always surgical, moving through the situation with a precision that stripped away everything decorative and left only the structural reality. The structural reality was this: 3 Selûne border systems were now exposed. The conventional response options were inadequate. The Empire, for the first time in 6,000 years of unbroken continuity, was looking at something that had no historical precedent in its own experience, and therefore no institutional memory for how to survive it. The session ran for 2 hours before Valith named the option. She did not ease into it. That was not how she operated, and Rourke had come to understand that about her well enough to recognize, in the specific quality of the silence before she spoke, that what came next would not be something she had arrived at casually. She looked at him across the chamber, with the cold blue light at her temples burning at the steady brightness it reached when she had already decided something, and was now completing the formality of saying it aloud. And she told him she needed a strategic assessment on targeted Haruvek civilian infrastructure strikes. The chamber went very quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a room waiting for someone to speak. A different quality entirely, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, that the people inside it will remember afterward with unusual clarity. Rourke was aware of every senior commander in the room recalibrating their understanding of what this session had now become. He said no. Not loudly. Not with the performance of a man making a point in front of an audience, because he was not making a point and the audience was incidental. He said no the way he said everything consequential, which was clearly and without decoration, and then he said the rest of it. That this was the line he had drawn in the 11th week, that he had documented it, that she had said she understood, and that nothing that had happened in the Vel-Tharath corridor changed the calculation he had laid out then. He told her he understood what the Empire was facing. He told her he had no clean alternative that would produce the same outcome without crossing that line, and that he was aware of what that meant, and that the absence of a clean alternative was not evidence that the line was in the wrong place. One of the senior commanders started to say something. Rourke looked at him. The commander reconsidered. Valeth held his gaze for a long moment. The light beneath her skin dimmed to something he had not seen before, not the brightness of focus or the dimness of displeasure, but a different register entirely, the physiological signature of a decision arriving at its final form. Then she thanked him for his assessment, in the same tone she used when a briefing had reached its conclusion, and moved the session forward. Rourke stayed for the remainder of the session because leaving would have been a statement, and he had already made the only statement that mattered. He watched the session move through other options, contingency frameworks, defensive repositioning strategies, none of which addressed the core problem with anything approaching adequacy, all of which Valeth received and assessed with the same focused precision she brought to everything. 3 hours after the session ended, while Rourke was in his quarters staring at the ceiling with the specific alertness of a man who knows he will not sleep, Solith sent him a notification. A single line. No commentary, because Solith, for all his earnestness, understood when commentary was not the thing. The order had gone through. The strikes were authorized. Rourke read the notification twice. Then he got up, went to the supply terminal, and asked it for coffee. It produced, after its usual moment of computational hesitation, the brown, warm liquid that was almost the thing he wanted. He drank it standing at the terminal in the dark, and he thought about a line he had drawn 11 weeks ago, and a queen who had listened to everything he said and understood every word of it and crossed it anyway. And he thought about the difference between understanding something and being bound by it. And he thought about the 6,000 years of unbroken civilization now sitting on the other side of that distinction. And he did not sleep for a very long time. The war ended on a Thursday, which Rourke felt was the most honest thing it could have done. Thursdays had always struck him as the day the week finally admitted what it was, not the false promise of Monday, not the relief of Friday, just the plain, undecorated truth of where you had arrived and what it had cost you to get there. 11 days after the strikes, the Haruvek Collective requested a cessation of hostilities. 14 days after that, they signed a negotiated settlement that secured every contested corridor, stabilized all 3 exposed border systems, and preserved the territorial integrity of an empire that had been, 3 weeks prior, genuinely uncertain whether it had a future. By every metric that military history recognized as meaningful, the Selûne Empire had won. Rourke wrote it up in his final strategic assessment with the same plain language he had always used. He noted the outcome. He noted the method. He noted, as he had noted everything, what he had recommended and what he had not, and where the line between those two things had been drawn and held and then crossed without him. He submitted the document to the Imperial Record Office, where a very polite administrator told him it would be archived with full classification, and he told her, with equal politeness, that he would also be retaining a personal copy. And she looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something they find both surprising and entirely unsurprising. The information moved through Selûne society, the way information moves through any society when it is true and documented and relevant to something people care about deeply. Which is to say, it moved faster than anyone in authority would have preferred and slower than it felt to the people watching it spread. It began with legal scholars. It always began with legal scholars. Someone in the Imperial Record Office, or someone adjacent to someone in the Imperial Record Office, allowed the right document to be seen by the right set of eyes. And those eyes belonged to people whose entire professional lives were organized around a civilization's ethical commitments. And those people began asking questions with the specific, focused energy of individuals who have found something that requires answering. Solith brought him the first public dispatch on a morning 3 weeks after the ceasefire. He set his pad on the desk with the careful precision of a man delivering something fragile and said nothing, which told Rourke everything about the content before he read a word of it. He read it. Then he set the pad down and looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought, not for the first time, about how documentation was the only honest gift he had ever consistently given anyone. "The scholars are citing your refusal filings," Solith said. "I know. All 5 of them. I know, Solith. They're calling them a primary historical record." He paused. "That's quite significant, apparently, in terms of legal weight." "I imagine it is." Solith sat down across from him, which he rarely did without being invited, and which meant something was coming that he had decided deserved the formality of a seated conversation. "She cannot share the responsibility," he said. "The documentation makes it. There is no ambiguity about where the decision originated. Your refusal is the record. Her order is the record. There is nothing between them that distributes the weight." Rourke thought about the night of the order, the brown almost coffee, the ceiling of his quarters, the specific texture of the silence after Solith's notification. He thought about a queen who had listened to every word he said and understood it, and done what she needed to do anyway, and had done it without his name on it, without his cover, without the protective architecture of expert endorsement that would have allowed the history to read differently. He had always assumed she kept him out of it to protect the decision. It had only recently occurred to him that she might have kept him out of it to protect him. The abdication came 6 weeks after the ceasefire. There was no coup, no political mechanism, no removal by force or legal compulsion. The Saloon had a process for this, ancient, formal, voluntary, that predated most of Earth's current nations and had been used in 6,000 years exactly 4 times. Valith invoked it herself, which was the detail that Rourke turned over the most in the days that followed, because it meant she had understood from the moment she signed the order that this was the eventual destination, and she had signed it anyway, and he could not decide whether that was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed or the saddest, or whether those 2 things were, in the end, the same. On his last evening on Velanath, she met with him in the receiving chamber, the enormous room with the chairs that had never been designed for human spines. He sat at his customary angle, which his lower back acknowledged with its customary editorial opinion, and she sat across from him, and the room had the quality of a room in which something is being completed rather than begun. She asked him what he would do now. He told her he would go home, write a longer version of the assessment for his own records, and probably have a real coffee for the first time in 7 months, at which point she asked what real coffee was, and he explained. And she considered this for a moment, and said it sounded unnecessarily complicated for something that only made a person adequately alert, and he said that was a fair summary of most things humans found worth doing. Then the humor settled, the way humor sometimes settles when it has done the work it came to do, and she asked him the question he had been waiting for since the night of the order, whether he would have done it, if it had been his civilization, his people, his name on the authorization. He sat with it honestly, turning it over the way he had turned it over every night for 7 months, looking for a clean answer and finding, instead, the same complicated truth he always found, that he had built a life around a line precisely because he did not fully trust himself not to cross it under sufficient pressure, and that the line was only meaningful because the pressure was real, and that he had no certain knowledge of what he would have done with 6,000 years of civilization in one hand and a weapons authorization in the other. He told her he swore he wouldn't. She almost smiled. Not the brief, careful flicker of the early briefings, but something fuller, something that reached the copper of her eyes and stayed there for a moment. And Rourke, who had spent 7 months being honest with her and watching her be honest in return, and learning that honesty and comfort were not the same transaction, smiled back. He left Velanath on a Friday, which felt right. Fridays, at least, had the decency to feel like an ending. Solith walked him to the docking bay carrying a farewell package from the station supply system, 17 varieties of nutrient concentrate, neatly labeled, with a handwritten note explaining which one was considered most calming. Rourke looked at it for a long moment. Then he tucked it under his arm and carried it onto the ship, because Solith had written the note himself, and some things you keep not because they are useful, but because they are true. He slept most of the journey home, deeply without interruption for the first time in 7 months. When he woke, he wrote one final entry in his personal record, not the official assessment, not the documented refusal, but the other kind of writing, the kind with no audience and no archive, the kind a person does only for themselves. He wrote about a line and